Hey folks, back again. We were just talking about the beginning of the French and Indian War, and I promised not a blow by blow thing with all this, but we had to get Braddock's story out because it's so good and it's important. Because Braddock's uh, attack on Fort Duquesne sends Native Americans jumping all about the place with the French, and they start to put a whooping on Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. Now, these British colonists are the point of the spear aimed right at these Native Americans. Unfortunately for these colonists, they were also settlers, and they were often out on homesteads like out near what's today Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And we're going to take a look at Pennsylvania here right now because it's important for a much larger reason about how these people became known as white people. This was not something in Pennsylvania before the French and Indian War, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. So, if you're out in the dark, and remember, it's dark out in rural areas now. Imagine how dark it was out in the woods of Pennsylvania in 1755. And you hear what sounds like something besides non human animals. And you begin to suspect there's people out there in the dark that want to really, really ruin and end your life, and not in a nice way. Remember, I said the Europeans brought killing non-combatants into warfare in this part of North America, and that's true. But by 1755, I can promise you, actually long before that, Native Americans had taken up the same practice as they tended to do with a lot of these things. Larger principle: the more you fight people, often the more you become like them. It's a problem. Anyway, but out of necessity, otherwise you might lose. Maybe it's debatable. Let's get back to it. So, Pennsylvania was filled with Euro American British colonists by 1755. The Quakers, who founded the colony in 1680, William Penn, hence Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods, were a gift to make up for a debt to his daddy, who had done some serious imperialism in the Caribbean on behalf of the English crown, uh, capturing Jamaica from the Spanish and other slave islands down there. Very nice. So the pacifist Quaker, Penn, unlike Daddy, he and his fellows created the only unarmed colony, and a successful one. Everybody else armed to the teeth, not the Quakers, as you probably know. Um, Hold on to Quakers for a second. I'm going to play a role in the story. I don't have time to go through the whole. You want to do a Wikipedia thing on Quakers? Good, or something better. Who knows? In Philadelphia, newspapers wanted colonists to rally to the cause of fighting the Native Americans and their French imperial sort of structural backbone. As I'd explained in the previous video a little bit about that. So, these people in Pennsylvania did not like each other. They were different Protestant denominations, uh, Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Moravians, who people then mistook for Catholics, alarming them greatly, and confusing some of my students every semester who think the Moravians were Catholics, but that wasn't his point. They just looked like Catholics to other people. These people all detested one another in Christian brotherly love. They really hated each other because they spoke the wrong language, they had the wrong culture, and certainly the wrong theology, which gets those people really jazzed up, as it does today. So, what to do in the face of families being slaughtered, raped, murdered in the dark out there, refugees coming into Philadelphia, coming into little towns out around Harrisburg, things like that. Well, the answer was to come up with the idea of white people. See, this is not German or Scottish or Scandinavian of some kind. French, who knows? Well, not French so much, man. Scots Irish. My ancestors on my father's side. Uh, First one arrived in Philadelphia in 1743. And the first Lapsley to arrive. And he joined his fellow Scots Irish in a kind of backwoods, alcohol fueled, Native American hating road to hillbillydom. Definitely. Major players in the whole thing eventually. But then there were plenty of Scots Irish in Pennsylvania back then. We cut to later, we look at the Paxton Boys. You can do a little search on Paxton Boys, see what I mean? Benjamin Franklin described them as worse than Indians. Which was actually true. So, anyway, the newspapers say all good white people have suffered at the hands of these heathen savages. This book, I teach a chapter out of every semester about this very process. As a good colonial historian, Dr. Silver read his colonial newspapers really closely and noticed that the term white people never shows up until 1755. Like, what's going on? Did they just do some kind of scientific investigation and discover there was some kind of weird genetic link or something? Certainly not. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth, ever. Really. But the idea of white people, which the colonies already had, but not Pennsylvania so much because it wasn't a slave labor based colony, unlike Virginia, which clearly was. It was white people on top, black people on the bottom, free, slave, not much in between, and growing tobacco and taking native land to do so as much as possible. That is different from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, the roots of the concept of white people is rooted in Native American warfare. And this title came in second in my recent title contest to the Sons of Kemet, whose album Your Queen is a Reptile I recommend to everybody. All right, so leave that aside for the moment. And what are the consequences of this? Well, Quakers were not reliable white people at all. They were an outrage. They had lost power in Pennsylvania over the course of a couple of generations, 2 or 3, since Penn in 1680, remember? And more people related to me, like Scots Irish, started playing more of a role in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania politics. The Quakers still had big money, and Quakers were slaveholders back then. Remember, it's only right around the time of the American Revolution, coincidentally, and Enlightenment ideals, secular ideas starting to influence religious people, which is a big part of the story. They started ditching slavery around then. Pretty quickly, actually. They're famous for this, and they're going to be big-time abolitionists, feminists, and lots of cool things. Pacifists, too, if you're into that. I think there's a lot to be said for it, just frankly, but we'll leave that as may. Not much pacifism going on in our story right now. So, Quakers were thought to be unreliable white people. And in the 18th century, that didn't mean like they were some kind of just race traitor or something like that. They were that, but more complicated. They thought that because of their ideas about Native Americans and stuff, the Quakers were becoming literally, in some cases, darker, more native, going savage, like our neighbors. There were reports in Philadelphia of people seeing Quakers' skin darker than it was before. Shading. Very anxiety producing. People inheriting from the 17th century the idea that the environment shaped their idea of the nature nurture debate actually was pretty oddly enough rooted in nurture much more than nature. The tabula rasa idea, John Locke, the Enlightenment guy, even though that's not right, everybody knows it. We didn't even need Steven Pinker to tell us. In fact, Pinker, his bad book, draws up a straw man and goes after that, as most of his books do. Never mind. Anyway, so Steven Pinker, search. So, because we will never pass this way again, maybe, I want to make sure that you know about this Enlightenment book about Denis Diderot, the guy who made the big Enlightenment Encyclopedia and one of the biggest atheists of the 18th century and one of its greatest thinkers, truly. This is a great biography, very readable, super good. Enlightenment plug, there you go. So, hopefully we will meet again, but you know, you never know. So, the Quakers. The Quakers were always helping Native Americans. Like, if there was like a treaty to be done for new land being taken, Native Americans losing more land, which was always the story. It was never Native Americans gaining more land. Never. So, in all that, the Quakers would like help them kind of function as like their little brokers and lawyers. This pissed other white people off enormously. And Native Americans could be seen going around. I don't have a Quaker hat with me, but you know what they look like from the fake Quaker on Quaker Oats, Larry. You know the Quaker Oats didn't come from Quakers, right? Larry's just a fictional Quaker because he looks wholesome, cherub cheeked. So, Quakers are turning into Native Americans. Native Americans are turning into Quakers. They are like a fifth column. That means like an enemy within your side. I'm not sure what the other four columns are. I don't remember. If you do, good for you. But that's the term everybody always uses. So at this point, if you said, well, you know, we're the ones pushing them off their land, no wonder they're coming after us. And who are they going to come after first? The people right on the front, which are settlers, right? The informal empire model that way. Now, these settlers are like white people like me. We just showed up here eventually, and we don't think of ourselves as done anything wrong. We're just out here in the woods trying to make a living, and these heathen savages just bent on slaughter, rape, and destruction for no particular reason whatsoever, other than they're just savages. They don't see anything like, well, I just see black, dark woods and people tomahawking my loved ones to death in front of me and worse. And these people really are victims. I'm not trying to shortchange that whatsoever. I don't think my description does that. And yet, of course, it's not the full picture. The full picture is that these people are the point of the spear. Now, if you said that in Philadelphia in 1755, there would be some hot water because people were not down with that whatsoever. If you didn't see white people as innocent victims, you're not a good white person. This is a fundamental key aspect of white identity in North America, particularly out of the British colonies, other stories with the Spanish and elsewhere, some similar but different stuff. Don't worry about it right now. Because the British colonies are the backbone of what later becomes the United States of America, I focus there first before I check it out. The other stuff's not irrelevant, though, and actually, it does play a big role eventually, but nothing like this. As most people kind of intuitively sense, even though intuition is not terribly valuable. In this case, it's right. So I usually ask my students, like, what other kind of examples can you think of this sort of thing? And if there's somebody, kind of paying attention, they'll usually say, oh, it could be like 9/11, like in 2001, after 9/11, if you said, well, the United States is not exactly like been not throwing elbows for a long time in its rise to world supremacy, despite the mythical informal empire or not empire, anti-empire empire, all that stuff, that somebody's going to hit back for whatever reason, good, bad, or ugly. And Susan Sontag said this in New York, and she was mercilessly persecuted for this. Much the way, if you pointed out that white people are not just innocent victims in this whole thing in Philadelphia, you were mercilessly persecuted as well, including Quakers in their own colony. That sucked. Fortunately, they had a lot of money, which, in hierarchical capitalist society, given your druthers, you'd rather have that, right? If you have to deal with all this, would you rather be poor or rich? Question and answer. So this is the second major source of white identity in British North America. First, of course, being slavery in Virginia, Maryland, elsewhere, down in the Carolinas, and everywhere. I mean, slavery was everywhere. But what I mean is a labor force. The labor force that is defined by being African or not, even before the concept of race exactly. Okay. So that's a big deal about the French and Indian War. Really big deal. Much bigger deal than what you'll hear in a lot of other accounts if they miss that point. Let me say just a couple more things here. I know we're going to run a little bit long. I'll finish this up real quick, though. So the war turns to the British favor. Again, I promise no blow by blow, but this is important and it's real quick. In 1758, William Pitt takes over the Southern District for imperialism or whatever it was. And this guy pours money into beating the French in India, in Europe, and in North America, putting 167,000 troops and navy to this cause, 18 million pounds back then, which was a fortune. This is war gone transoceanic and mega. They overwhelmed the French in Canada. You've seen those stories, fall of Montreal, Quebec. They win a lot of stuff. Let me just give you a couple of their stuff winnings here. Listen to what they got. It's pretty cool. They got all of Canada and all the French claims east of the Mississippi, including the Ohio Valley, where all those Native Americans were, who had no say in this. This was the Treaty of Paris, 1763, and no Native Americans were at the Treaty of Paris. The British got Senegal, a West African slave trade base. Excellent, well done. And included West Indian sugar slave islands, Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent, Tobago. Just to be chill about the whole thing, the British returned Guadeloupe, Martinique, and St. Lucia, French sugar slave plantation islands, to them because the British are always so civil about everything. French got some fishing stations. The French were running a big deficit with Canada. Canada was not a big money maker for them with the remember all the beavers turned into hats and all that. And they were thrilled to get those sugar slave plantations back. It was very lovely for them. Uh, and this is pretty funny. I didn't even mention Spain coming into the war. They did in 1760, but they just sort of joined in a lot of losing by the French. They lost all of Florida, and to get Havana and Manila back from the British, they just gave Florida to the British. So after the Treaty of Paris, as Taylor says, British America stretched from the Arctic to the Caribbean. Well done. Big problem, though. Big problem. This cost a lot of money. And it was the biggest war bill anybody had run up since Louis XIV, maybe back in France. And so Pitt said it'll be kind of pay as you go thing. Colonists chip in 40%, we'll cover 60. But that 40% added up to be a big buttload at the end of the war. And that's when you're going to get stuff like the Stamp Act and all that kind of stuff in New England in particular. This is critical for New England. New England had been through 3 of these wars, making widows and mutilated mental and physical people and orphans and everything else since the 1690s. Economy was looking bad in Boston. We've lost a lot of your adult male population. There's like real poverty in Boston. And that's the seeds of one part of the American Revolution, not the whole thing by a long shot, but it is one. And New England's problems with the Treaty of Paris and the results of the French and Indian War will contribute directly to the American Revolution in ways that are more important than why a colony like Virginia went to war, which we're going to take up those kind of issues on our next episode, unless I'm leaving something out that I meant to. Hope not. Sorry, this one ran a little long, but I want to get all this in so we can clear the deck and hopefully move on to the American Revolution itself. So thank you for listening, and take care, and say goodbye to Frederick, who's under his eye. So blessed be the fruit, right? Right on, right on.